Despite the first actual muscle car being made far back in 1949, muscle cars are definitely synonymous with the 60s. The age of muscle cars was, in a way, the golden age of cars. It was the post-war era, and the bubbling economy meant that people could afford to spend big on vehicles. It was also an age when a lot of people weren't yet keen about watching the greenhouse effect of cars, making it a time where corporations had the freedom to basically make anything. In fact, corporations were encouraged to absolutely go berserk in designing muscle cars that had the highest performance and, of course, the most amazing sounds. The result of that was an absolutely magical decade of car manufacturing and an unbelievable number of amazing muscle cars. Join us because in today's video we'll take a look at 10 muscle cars from the 60s and we'll be taking them on a sound test to see which ones actually sound the greatest, in our opinion of course. Number 10, 1965 Ford Shelby Mustang GT350. The 1965 Shelby Mustang GT350 is so good and sounded so good that it's almost a sacrilege to leave the car out when talking about muscle cars in the 60s. The Ford was released in 1965 when the muscle car market was really approaching its peak and was technically Ford's attempt to show the market what it could build. Aside from being a fantastic example of a muscle car, the Shelby Mustang GT350 was one of the vehicles that established the Mustang brand. The car looked and felt like a race car, but still managed to hang with the muscle cars and compete favorably with them. Of course, the secret of the vehicle was its engine, which came with 306 horsepower with a top speed of 138 miles per hour. And yes, the car sounded really good. Number 9, 1960 Corvette. The 1960 Corvette was the first real muscle car of the 60s, and what a car it was. Of course, over the next few years, a few cars would come to upstage the Corvette, but very few cars have managed to have that lasting classic energy that propels a vehicle down the ages. A critical person might argue that the Corvette doesn't even look like a 60s car at all, and rather looks like something from the 1930s, and they might be right. The design of the 1960 Corvette is very retro, even for a 60s vehicle, but if the Corvette doesn't totally have that classic muscle car look, it certainly has that classic muscle car sound. With a 270 horsepower engine with twin 4-power carburetors, it would have been a crime for the Corvette not to sound like a proper muscle car. Number 8, 1969 Dodge Challenger. The Dodge Challenger wasn't just a Challenger by name. It was also a Challenger that pushed the boundaries of what's possible with muscle cars. Interestingly, the 1965 Dodge Challenger only really got on the roads in the 70s, so there's an argument to be had that it doesn't belong on this list. But since the vehicle was formally unveiled in 1969, it's probably not amiss to say that the car was made in the likelihood of the muscle cars that ruled the road at the time. The Dodge Challenger would go on to be one of the longest lasting cars in the world, with model years spanning 3 generations and around 50 years. While the vehicle is not a muscle car today, it's rather difficult to look at the vehicle now and not remember the wonder of the 60s and the beautiful muscle cars that gave it color. Number 7, 1969 Dodge Charger Daytona. Right now, the Dodge Daytona kind of looks like something you'd see in a low-budget alien flick, but around 50-odd years ago, this vehicle was to die for. For one, it was incredibly fast. It was so fast that it was the first vehicle in NASCAR history to pass 200 miles per hour. While that speed might not look like a huge deal today, it's something instructive to remember that the super fast cars we have today are a recent invention. It wasn't common to go even 150 miles per hour in the 60s, and the Daytona didn't just do that, it also went past the 200 miles per hour mark. That's something. Number 6. 1967 Buick Grand Sport 340. The 1977 Buick Grand Sport is, in our opinion, the most underrated muscle vehicle of all time. For one, the vehicle has a pretty respectable engine underneath its hood. The engine was a 5.6-liter small block V8 that made 260 horses and 365 pound-feet of torque. It wasn't the greatest engine on the market, but it did a pretty great job, and it made one of the greatest roars a muscle car can ever make. The sound from the engine was music to the ears, and it would just about make any muscle car enthusiast weep. However, the Buick, despite its promise, didn't really live up to the expectations. Yes, the engine was great, but the vehicle is also pretty heavy and would have needed a stronger engine for it to really have that muscle car kick. Number 5. 1964 Chevrolet Chevelle. The Chevrolet Chevelle was a screamer of a car. Yes, the car looked really distinct and would certainly never be forgotten in a hurry. But what made the Chevrolet Chevelle stand out was the way that it sounded, and that was due to the powerful 327 cubic inch V8 engine that was beneath the car's hood. It was the muscle car of muscle cars, and when the car saw its end in 1978, so many muscle car enthusiasts were very sad to see it go. Number 4. 1966 Oldsmobile Tornado. While muscle cars were all the rave in the 60s, their popularity didn't last for long. That's why a lot of muscle cars didn't really have a great lifespan on the market. In fact, by the early 80s, almost all the muscle vehicles that were made in the 60s had gotten retired. However, the Oldsmobile was one of the few vehicles that had a very long lifespan on the market. In a way, it's kind of a coincidence that a vehicle that was able to sustain 4 generations would be called an Oldsmobile. While the Oldsmobile did look good, that wasn't the reason why it was such a huge financial success. The reason why lay under the car's hood, and was a 425 cubic inch V8 engine that was certainly one of the most powerful engines of its time. And yes, this engine gave a loud roar. Number 3. 1969 Chevrolet Camaro ZL1. The Chevrolet Camaro ZL1 was one of the most important muscle vehicles made in the 60s. While the first generation of the Chevrolet Camaro had 2 model years before the 1969 Camaro, the 1969 model represented the apex of the 60s Chevrolet Camaro. It was fast, had amazing handling, had a superb engine, and looked good. It was the quintessential muscle car of the 60s. Number 2. 1964 Pontiac GTO. The 1964 Pontiac GTO was a classic by any definition. The car was so near perfect that it was nicknamed the GOAT, which is an acronym for the greatest of all time. Now, the Pontiac is certainly not the greatest 60s muscle car of all time, but given the fact that it's come second on this list, it's pretty close. Underneath the vehicle's hood is a shiny 6.4-liter V8 engine that can produce 325 horsepower, and the roar to die for. This car doesn't just look like the greatest muscle car of all time, it also sounds like one. Number 1. 1968 Plymouth Roadrunner 426 Hemi. And at the top of this list, we have a vehicle that everyone who knows anything about muscle cars wants to ride. The Roadrunner is the Muhammad Ali of 60s muscle cars. There's basically no way to talk about muscle cars in the 60s without mentioning the Roadrunner. The Roadrunner didn't get the honor of arguably being the most important muscle car in the 60s by just looking good. It also got it by being a proper muscle car with a satisfying roar and an engine that could do incredible things. In 1968, the Plymouth Runner could churn out 335 horsepower and could go from 0 to 60 miles per hour in just about 7 seconds. That's insane for a car in the 60s. But isn't that the reason why the vehicle tops this list?